Cheers.
Cheers.
There's something
Cheers,
that
my
we
brother.
do in almost everything. So
a lot has happened in Richmond in the past 6 months.
wait, what's happened?
Tell us, what your perspective is. Ace, I'll throw it to you first.
And we're in the middle of a global pandemic. I don't know if anybody knows that. That's
Heard
news. So yeah, I mean, COVID, particularly with the major health system here in town, has affected the city the same way it's affected the country, the rest of the world. But on top of that, we've got this racial injustice, right? I hear it phrased as everything that happened or what went on. It's like, no, we got cops killing black folks. To call it what it is. And there's this tenor, I think, to what we see, the inequity, the injustice, the police brutality. There's a tenor to the conversation this time.
Yeah.
Started with George Floyd and the demographics involved in a lot of the conversation, the protests, the activism, and yes, some of the riots, which I'm sure we'll get into, but I think are requisite. That has shifted, and there's a major movement, arguably the largest civil rights movement in human history, is happening now, and part of that is here in the former capital of the Confederacy. That's interesting.
It's got legs too. It wasn't that long ago we had a million women march a couple times, but that seemed to come and go. And this thing doesn't seem to be going.
No.
It's coming and coming and coming and building. So y'all that are we all see it from our own perspectives, but you guys that are Richmonders, what does it look like, for you?
There's a quote on the Lee Monument. It says this time is different. I don't know if you guys
There's a
have
couple
seen
of
it.
other quotes
There's
that I
several
thought
quotes. There's several quotes on the monument, but there's this one in particular. It's on the side, and it's in small, all caps. And it says this time is different. And I think that's the perfect explanation for what's going on. I mean, to Ace's point, I think everybody had to be quiet and shut in the house because outside was closed in order for this to actually work, right? It's not like it was orchestrated. I mean,
it's a perfect storm.
It was the perfect storm, though, because when you have nothing else to do, you don't have a distraction. And so you now don't have a distraction. Everyone is facing the reality that we've been living forever for 400 plus years. And I think what's happening now is there's a combination of a new generation rising, like this new generation of young folks. I'm like, oh, y'all are not playing. Like, you are calling people out and you do not care. And I love it, right? I love the energy. And there's also something that comes with that gets our generation to say, yes, and we are here for you because we have the brand equity, we have the dollars, we have the ability to then move substantive change forward. So things that were taking 4 years now take 4 days because people are listening, but the right people are speaking up and saying, you know what, we're kind of over it.
Well, and that's the interesting thing. You reference this. Y'all are all thought leaders because you're entrepreneurs here in Richmond, and each of you has your kind of own slice. There does seem to be a positive look forward.
Yeah.
So Zane, I know you and I've talked about this some. Tell us about the positive outlook.
Yeah, so I think it ties into what Rashida was talking about. I think one of the great things about Richmond is there's this entrepreneurial spirit that is not a San Francisco kind of feel, right? I mean, here, when somebody says, can I have coffee with you, leader, to talk about my idea, the leader actually shows up, right? I mean, so that's really cool. And so what it creates is a sense of optimism. And so, Ace talked about sort of the demographics of the movement this time. And I'll tell you, I'm optimistic about what I see in terms of the young folks that are coming out. Not only just their drive, but their representation across cultures.
We have all the what's going on social activism with the statues. From a technology startup, things, you feel like it's hindered it? Has this slowed it down? Do people look at Richmond and say that's not where we want to put our money?
I think it's it has set an interesting bar. The pandemic has in normalizing taking virtual meetings and making virtual deals.
Right.
So from a funding perspective, Richmond is a second-tier city. I don't say that as a pejorative, right? Steve Case did the Rise of the Rest tour, and we're all talking about getting out of New York, Boston, and Silicon Valley, where all of the dollars are spent. You know, for folks who look like me in the high growth, scalable tech game, arguably being here and the quality of life, despite the second place trophies we've had lining our city, I've now got an opportunity where I can get in touch with, you know, Graycroft or Bain or fill in the blank. Like, those folks are more willing and able to make virtual deals from afar because now everybody's working remotely. We're all working from home. We've actually leveled the playing field in a lot of respects for a city that has not particularly been great at funding companies. I mean, for as much as I love this town, it's a great place to live. You kind of got to go elsewhere to get money. Now I think we've leveled out a bit, and that I'm curious to see what that looks like in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I think, you know, what's interesting, Earl, is this moment in time has sort of separated from an entrepreneurial perspective, sort of the old Richmond from the new Richmond. So, you know, the entrepreneurial part of Richmond, honestly, COVID has been a little bit of a bump in the road. It's changed things a little bit, but, you know, most young people, most folks that are in the entrepreneurial space, it's business as usual. Yeah. I think for what we might call the old world Richmond, or, you know, the part of Richmond that isn't really focused on entrepreneurialism, I think the disruption there has been a lot bigger.
There is an old garden I want to, because we were filming the other day. Yeah. I'm sure you remember this, Zane. You were out. You know, when you think about Richmond and some of the industries, insurance, finance, creative talent, those are kind of the big three. I saw the old guy in his Lexus driving down Monument Avenue. We're filming a Robert E. Lee statue. And he's in a tie, and this is maybe 2-3 months ago. Yeah. So, like, beginning of lockdown, right? So if he's going to work, he's going to a bank downtown, or a law firm downtown, right?
9 a.m.
Right? Like, he's driving down Monument Ave from the fan. Like, you can connect some dots and figure out where he's heading. Yeah. This is the guy who rolls down his window and yells to us with a full film crew, go to work. Right? Like, there's an old guard that exists in Richmond, and that old guard is rearing its real ugly head. But it helps to understand who those people are. You're sharing that story about the business leader in town, and all of the people who've liked that post are executives here and leaders there. I mean, we're seeing this divide. There's a line of delineation very similar to the monuments that were that demarcation line.
Well, so,
we're seeing it now.
And that's Rashida, I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Because you are, my daughter's school, Maggie Walker Governor School. Yep. You were in the first class at this incredible school named after Maggie Walker, who is an icon of the city. Yeah. And yet your experience there was a little different. You don't get more Richmond than having a diploma from Maggie Walker.
Yeah. Right.
What was that like for you, and what has that experience been?
Well, the thing that I'll tell you about that is, so when I went there, it was not at Maggie Walker High School. And I think that context is important because Maggie Walker High School was one of the 2 black high schools during segregation. Like, it was created for black students. When they started the school, they didn't know if it was going to work. So we showed up and they were like, we're going to get us a shot. And I consider myself to be a graduate of Richmond Public Schools, which is predominantly black and always has been. But at that time, we also had predominantly black teachers. I had a white teacher in 1st grade and didn't have another white teacher until I got to Maggie Walker. And it was on the 3rd floor of Thomas Jefferson High School, which also matters because they put this elite group of students on the top floor of a predominantly black high school. And they started created this delineation, a school that they were talking about closing at the time. There was a walkout my sophomore year about that. And so they had already started creating this elitist environment and perception during that time. For me, it was difficult, and for my peers, it was difficult. one, because they didn't know what to do with us, so they were just like throwing too much academic work at a group of 13 and 14-year-olds. But more importantly, because there was this attitude of those other kids. And so, but those other kids were my friends that I grew up with, and they looked like me. And I was uncomfortable in this other space. And so it got to this place of, you know, you're a quota, you kind of, all the things that you would imagine, right? You're
Typical
here because
tropes.
you're a quota, you don't really fit, that kind of thing. And the school is now in its 29th year, and that's still happening. I've talked to the students. They're still experiencing that. That is their experience. And so we have been saying this of there is a culture, and I said this in the public comments to a board meeting 2 weeks ago. I said, you have failed to address the fact that this school's culture is centered on whiteness and affluence. And until you solve that problem, you're going to continue to have a diversity issue. Because if you have a poor experience, who's going to talk? The parent that says, I'm thinking of sending my kid here. Oh, you don't want to do that.
Right.
And that becomes your recruiting problem. So your retention problem becomes your recruiting problem and your pipeline problem. Well, that conversation has elevated in these past few months. And I think it is getting more traction. There's a lot that is happening there, but it's because of what's going on. But for me, like, my co-founders, when we talk about Jackson Ward Collective, like, we look at Maggie, we think about Maggie Walker. We're like, you know, Miss Maggie led the way here.
The person, not the school.
The person, not the school.
Right.
And so to have such an amazing, inspirational person.
I mean, it was the Black Wall Street.
And the birthplace of Black capitalism. And what they don't know is that Jackson Ward was actually kind of first named Black Wall Street. It was the destruction of Tulsa that elevated that name, but it was the destruction of 95 cutting straight through Jackson Ward that destroyed Jackson Ward.
Which Don Treese is exactly what you guys are trying to address. So we visited at the Hippodrome today.
Absolutely. And just to set that up too, I mean, just thinking about it, the statues have been around for a while. But the statues are not the only remnant of a really dark past.
Right.
You guys, with this hidden in plain sight, actually look at places that people no longer remember what that was.
We're covering that in our Hidden in Plain Sight. We're covering the person of Maggie Walker, not so much the school, but the person and inspiration she was. And so the whole concept behind Hidden in Plain Sight is the fact that there are things within our city that we are walking by every single day that had a tremendous effect in the city of Richmond, the culture of Richmond, the economics of Richmond, that are being erased, that are totally being erased.
Wait, I've heard this argument before.
You're trying to get rid of history.
Yeah, and so ironically, when you look at some of the sites that we're looking at, when we look at the plight and the struggle and the fight of the African American, the Black experience here in Richmond, the pain and the suffering, all of those things within our research that we've done with our first initial 10 sites, those that rose up in that category are erased. They're parking lots. You talk about neighborhoods, you talk about Jackson Ward, you talk about Navy Hill, you talk about Lumpkins Jail, you talk about the Richmond 34 sit-in at the Tallheimers. It's a parking lot now.
You throw 95 and the expressway into the mix, and you look at two historically Black neighborhoods that got
you destroy
Devastated.
Even the cemeteries. Like
absolutely. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are telling those narratives, that we are bringing them to the light so that folks can understand not only the pain that was there in terms of Lumpkins Jail, which we spent some time at today, but also the celebration of Maggie Walker, the celebration of the Hippodrome, and those types of things.
Friggin' amazing. Everyone
those are, I mean, that area in Jackson Ward, you know, we talked about, you know, pick an era. I think it was one of us that we were talking, pick an era to go back to live in. I would love to be back in that era of Jackson Ward when it was just hopping with the Eggleston Hotel, the Hippodrome, everything within that, the culture that we were bringing to this city as the Harlem of the South. was ridiculous.
Well,
and
in
it's
the
taken away.
business that you see, right? You had insurance companies, you have financial services, like everything that we need as a community. And then when you see that community thrive, then all of a sudden, I mean, this is systemic racism.
Yeah, it's taken away.
The building of highways through communities is not unique to here.
No.
It happened everywhere.
Everywhere.
And like, when we think about what our goal and our mission is for Jackson Ward Collective, it is actually to just support Black business owners to build up that same spirit. It's learn, grow, and own in the Black community. Yes, it's in Jackson Ward, but it's everywhere, right? How do we make those connections? How do you bring that forward? Because we do great together. But there are so many things that have put us off to the side. I mean, you spent time in my previous building. How many Black founders, not employees, did you see? Right.
But a handful.
Right, maybe.
Yeah.
And
Maybe
that's a
that.
stretch.
When you looked in the
But
mirror.
like, they're not there.
Well, I'm a big guy, so I'm most
You
of that
can see
handful.
yourself.
But there
But
are
like,
many.
it doesn't
Yeah.
exist. We're not there. We're not in, and we're not there because wealth gap. We have to keep our full-time jobs. We can't just be like, I'm gonna go start this thing and I'm gonna stop getting a paycheck. Like we can't afford to do that. And so then we don't have access.
There's a
to
safety net that's
resources.
requisite to take the risk to step into starting your own thing.
Right,
And
yeah.
like the systemic pieces, right? Like I go back to the interstates, right? And like it's a thing that we don't say as explicitly. The interstates are designed, we think they're designed to take people places. Let's be real clear about who those people are.
Right.
It's take the white folks through the Black neighborhoods without having to go through the Black neighborhoods, right? Like how do we get them out to the suburbs without having to, and get back downtown to the financial
That's
center
absolutely right.
without having to deal with us,
Yeah.
right? You know, like that's what we're talking about, but there's so many pieces of that systemic racism that exists that has, I mean, the redlining, I don't know if you saw the article, just redlining, the idea of drawing, literally they were red lines on maps, but denoting good neighborhoods versus bad neighborhoods, and that was typically along racial lines,
Yeah,
right?
Where you want to invest and where you don't want to invest.
Or where you won't let people who came from this area get a loan, make
Yeah.
investments, buy new property, or move on the other side of the line. And so when we think about the way education has been affected by that, the way generational wealth by buying property has been affected by that, so on and so forth. The access to income, the access to, once you start there and then you think about why we don't see founders necessarily represented in our incubator downtown, it's because most of us, a lot of us, have not had the privilege of having that safety net, or that I can move back home, or mom and pop's got me for a little bit. If it goes off the rails, I've got to have that job.
Godspeed. So, I mean, there's some movements that are happening now. The question is, are we going forward or backwards? I mean, what's the sense? What's the future for Richmond, especially from you guys' perspective?
I think Richmond has the potential to move forward just like anything else. I'm appreciative of everyone coming to the table and saying, I want to make this investment, I want to do this. The key that I am always focused on is this a one-time thing? Is it performative, or is it sustainable? And so when people come to me and my partners and say, you know, I want to invest in Black businesses, I'm like, that's great. Here's a start, but let's talk about full investments in Black-owned businesses. Like, let's actually nurture those so you can put real dollars into it. That's when I think we will know the answer of full progress. But we're making the right steps, and I think we're having the right conversations. We got to see action, and then
I think Richmond is one of those cities that I'm most hopeful about. And the reason for that is this is not a new struggle for us. As the capital of the Confederacy, this city's really been trying to deal with its history probably more than I would say any other city. And, you know, I really see what I think is the beginnings of a lot of change and a lot of positive change. You know, I think there's sort of 5 components, or 4 or 5 components that have to come together in order to make things really work for everybody. And I think that's the key. There are parts of this city that are going to naturally evolve and do just fine. There are others that are going to be lifted up, but there are parts of this city that are left behind. And in those areas, we really need to think about capital. How do we infuse capital into those areas? Credit. how do you get credit to people in those areas? Connections. How, if I'm in an area of the city where I've got a great business idea, but I have no way to connect to anybody, it's just a good idea out on an island, right? You need connections in order to make things work. You need other things to really help sort of make that business go forward.
Right.
So, those are three, but I think I'm hopeful because I see a lot of people who were on the sidelines in that conversation prior to COVID, prior to, the social unrest that we've had, now, coming off the bench, saying, hey, look, I'm suited up.
Yeah.
I want to, even if I'm just coming in for practice, or maybe a couple of minutes in the game, I want to be in the game.
Yeah.
So they're no longer on the bench. And I think that's the interesting part.
There's some people that look like me that think that things are not progressing. Right? I mean, you've seen a guy that looks like me that thinks that we're going backwards. We need to go make it better, make it good again.
Make it great again.
What do you think, Ace? What do you think?
Yeah, I think those people who want to make it great again, right?
Yeah.
Great was the 50s where we were segregated, or the 80s, we had the war on drugs and we were throwing us in jail. I mean, great. Black folks can't time travel, right? Like, it just doesn't make sense for us. So when I think about where we are, part of it is where Zane started. All we've had for a long time is hope. Like, we can't not be hopeful. I mean, think about what that would look like if you just lose hope. That's despair. Like, it doesn't get us anywhere. So, like, there's no other option than to be hopeful. But when I see some things, the statues coming down, great start, I suppose, right? Like, it can't be performative and it can't be pandering. And if that is the thing, taking our eye off the ball of police reform and, community oversight, et cetera, like, I'd rather keep those up and get the real work done. It's the first piece. The second for me is, I think about my work at the Health Innovation Consortium, to help health systems figure out how to make more efficient decisions and more effective. Part of what we did was turned the former Museum of the Confederacy behind Jefferson Davis's old house into a decontamination center for N95 masks. Right? Like, I mean, talk about using what I'd consider redundant space in Richmond, Virginia, as I was shooting emails to execs at the health system from the steps of Jefferson Davis's back porch. Right? Like, that for me is progress, where we're seeing that those aren't the things that define our city. They're remnants to a past that we don't care about, that we can use better to move forward. Like, there's some progress happening, and I think it starts with the hope that that's part of what we know.
And I just want to add to that, if I can, real quick. I think what you've done is really think about what are those future-focused outcomes that we want to have as a city and as a culture and as a society, versus the previous sort of backward-looking outcomes.
I would suggest that, much like the civil rights movement, it's white and black people working together. We had a very intriguing conversation with the U-Crops, Katie and Ted. And I will say that I think people are trying to come alongside, and we do want, Earl and I, the only white people at this table right now, we do want to come along and we want to help. Are there things that we need to pay attention to when we try to help?
Listening.
Yeah.
That's the thing I've been telling folks is, historically what happens is white folks will say, I want to help, and then they try to do. And you're not listening to what we're saying we need. And I've had this conversation with city council folks, I've had this conversation with a lot of folks, and I've said, we know what we need. We lack access to some things. Use your privilege.
Influence or privilege.
Right. Open the doors, connect the dots, make the access, and then come alongside, but don't try to take over and lead.
Right.
That's the role.
No, I mean, I think we're surrounded by smart folks here. I mean, you guys hit on everything. I think your points were valid. I also think that we're in a providential alignment with COVID and the social unrest to where folks are having to eat this in their face and realize what's going on. But I also love the idea of what you're doing with the collective is providing those resources for our groups, right? Like we don't have the resources. So stop trying to do for us and just allow us access to the things that will allow us to do those things. One of the things you hit, one of the things you hit on, which we talk about all the time, is generational wealth. Like we need to, as Black Americans, start to think about generational wealth. We need to start setting up our culture to understand generational wealth and what that means, so that we're not struggling the entire time. Because that's the biggest gap. What I see is white America, they have that, and they have the resources and access. So give us the resources and access, and then allow us to start to change our mentality to build generational wealth. And then action. We have to act. I'm tired of talking about it. I want to be about it. And what I feel now is our group of our generation is coming up as new emerging leaders in Richmond is phenomenal. Now we need to keep that and be inspired by the youth that are standing on the monuments, that are demanding change, that are inspiring us to do better things and pave the way for them to continue it. Because it's going to continue. We may not see the change, but at least we can be part of the change that helps the city.
As a Richmonder, I'm just so happy to be friends, new friends with all of y'all. You guys have such great perspective. And so thank you so much. Thank you for this time.
Thanks. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Great.
Cheers again.
Cheers, one last time. If we can't drink or change, we're going to drink.
And then change.
And then change.
There's so much more to explore, and we want you to join us on The Good Road.
For more in-depth content, meet us on the internet at thegoodroad.tv.
Hear more great stories, connect to organizations, and make sure you download our podcast, Philanthropology.